Chapter 5 The Halliwell Poem and the Legend. There is one manuscript which differs so much from all the others in its form and in its contents as to afford the strongest internal evidence that it is derived from a source entirely different from that which gave origin to the other and later documents. I allude to what is known to Masonic antiquaries as the Halliwell manuscript, and this is admitted to be the oldest Masonic document extant, and as some very important conclusions in respect to the early history of the craft are about to be deduced from it, a detailed account of it will not be deemed unnecessary. This work was first published in 1840 by Mr. James Orchard Halliwell under the title of A Poem on the Constitutions of Masonry. Footnote. In a brochure entitled The Early History of Freemasonry in England, a later improved edition was published in 1844. From the original manuscript in the King's Library of the British Museum. Mr. Halliwell, who subsequently adopted the name of Phillips, is not a member of the Brotherhood, and Woodford appropriately remarks that it is somewhat curious that to Grenadier and Halliwell, both non-Masons, Freemasonry owes the impetus, given at separate epochs, to the study of its archaeology and history. Footnote. In Kenning's Encyclopedia, Voke Halliwell. Halliwell says that the manuscript formerly belonged to Charles Thayer, a well-known collector of the 17th century. It is undoubtedly the oldest Masonic manuscript extant. Messrs. Bond and Egerton of the British Museum consider its date to be about the middle of the 15th century. Claus, footnote, Die Freimaurer in ihrer wahren Bedeutung, S12. Claus thinks that it was written between the years 1427 and 1445. Dr. Oliver, footnote, American Quarterly, Revision of Freemasonry, Volume 1, page 547. Dr. Oliver maintains that it is a transcript of the Book of Constitutions adopted by the General Assembly, held in the year 926 at the city of York. Halliwell himself places the date of the manuscript at 1390. Woodford, footnote, Preface to Hugin's Old Charges, page 7. Woodford concurs in this opinion. I am inclined to think that this is the true date of its transcription. The manuscript is in rhymed verse and consists of 794 lines. At the head of the poem is the inscription, Hic incipiunt constitutions artis geometria secundum Euclidum. The language is more archaic than that of Wycliffe's version of the Bible, which was written toward the end of the 14th century, but approaches very nearly to that the Chronicles of Robert of Gloucester, the date of which was at the beginning of the same century. Therefore, if we admit that the date of 1390, attributed by Halliwell and Woodford to the transcription in the British Museum, is correct, we may, I think, judging by the language, safely assign to the original the date of about 1300. Further back than this, philology will not permit us to go. Lines 1 through 86 of this manuscript contain the history of the origin of geometry or masonry, and the story of Euclid is given at length, much like that which is in the legend of the craft. But no other parts of that legend are referred to except the portion which records the introduction of Masonry into England. From the narrative of the establishment of Masonry in Egypt by Euclid, the poem passes immediately to the time when the craft come unto England. Here, the legendary story of King Athelstan and the assembly called by him is given, with this variation from the common legend that there is no mention of the city of York, where the assembly is said to have been held, nor of Prince Edwin, who summoned it. Lines 87 to 470 contain the regulations which were adopted at that assembly, divided into 15 articles and the same number of points. There is a very great resemblance, substantially, between these regulations and the charges contained in the subsequent or second set of manuscript constitutions. The regulations in the Halliwell poem are given at greater length, with more particularity, and generally accompanied with an explanation or reason for the law. After an interpolation, to be referred to hereafter, the poem proceeds under the title of Ars Quatuor Coronatorum, the art of the four crowned ones, a title never applied to Masonry in the later and purely English manuscripts. We have first an invocation to God and the Virgin, and then the legend of the four crowned martyrs, which ends on line 534. Now, this legend of the four crowned martyrs, footnote, see the full details of this legend in Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. Art, Four Crowned Martyrs. Die Vier Gekronten is found in none of the purely English manuscripts, but is of German origin and peculiar to the German Steinmetzen, or stonemasons of the Middle Ages. Its introduction in this manuscript is an evidence of the German origin of the document, and as Findel says, note, History of Freemasonry, Lyon's translation, page 31. Findel says, must be regarded as a most decided proof of the identity of the German and English stonemasons, and of their having one common parentage. The details of this legend close at the 534th line, and the poem then proceeds to give a small and imperfect portion of what is known in our later manuscripts as the legend of the craft. I am persuaded that all this part of the poem has been dislocated from its proper place, and that in the original the lines from 535 to 576 formed a portion of the legend of the craft, as it must have been inserted in the introductory part of the second manuscript. I think so. First, because in all other manuscripts the legend forms the exordium and precedes the charges. Secondly, because it has no proper connection with or sequence to the legend of the four crowned martyrs, which precedes it, and which terminates on the 354th line. And lastly, because it is evidently an interruption of the religious instructions which are taken up on line 577 and which naturally follow line 534. The writer, having extolled the Christian steadfastness and piety of the four martyrs, whose feast, he tells us, is on the 8th day after All Halloween, proceeds on line 576, to admonish his readers to avoid pride and covetousness and to practice virtue. There is here a regular and natural connection, which, however, would be interrupted by the insertion between the two clauses of an imperfect portion of a legend which has reference to the very beginning of the history of Masonry. Hence I conclude that all the part of the legend which described the events that were connected with Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel is an interpolation and belongs to another manuscript and to another place. In fact, the copyist had two manuscripts before him, and he transcribed sometimes from one and sometimes from the other, apparently with but little judgment, or rather, he copied the whole of one and then interpolated it with extracts from the other without respect to any congruity of subjects. The rest of the poem is occupied with instructions as to behavior when in church, when in the company of one's superiors, and when present at the celebration of the Mass. The whole ends with what we find in no other manuscript, the now familiar Masonic formula, Amen. So mote it be. Line 471 furnishes, I think, internal evidence that the poem was originally composed of two distinct works, written, in all probability, by two different persons, but in the copy which we now have, combined in one by the compiler or copyist. Mr. Woodford, also, is of the opinion that there are two distinct poems, although the fact had not attracted the attention of Halliwell. The former gentleman says that it seems to be in truth two legends and not only one. This is evident from the fact that this second part is prefaced by the title Alia Ordinatio Artis Geometria, that is, another constitution of the art of geometry. This title would indicate that what followed was a different ordinatio or constitution and taken from a different manuscript. Besides line 471, which is the beginning of the other or second constitution, does not fall into its proper place in following line 470, but is appropriately a continuation of line 74. To make this evident, I copy lines 70 to 74 from the poem and follow them by lines 471 to 474, whence it will be seen that the later lines are an appropriate and natural continuation of the former.